What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and it feels so good to be home to talk to all of you guys here, back in my setup with my light and with my microphone, and just be back home. And for those of you who are watching this and wondering, well, where have you been? If you haven't seen my more recent videos, about a month ago I got married, and the last 2 weeks I've actually been exploring the British Isles on a cruise with my wife for our honeymoon. It was a lot of fun. Ended up getting a little bit of sick near the end, which tends to happen with cruises as you're all kind of trapped on board this ship. And you know, there's plenty of people who don't know how to cover their mouth and not cough all over the place. But it was a really great time. Got to explore a lot of great places like Ireland and Scotland, and go to places like Liverpool and Wales. It got so many great memories with my wife, and it was just a nice break and step away. But because of that, I unfortunately missed out on a lot of big releases, including this, The Acolyte, which is why this review is coming out so late. I did watch the final episode while I was on my trip, but I wanted to, definitely give that time to take a break, spend time with my wife. And on top of that, I also missed things like Twisters, and Cobra Kai's back with its first part of its newest season. So I will be playing catch up now to try to get some of those reviews out, as well as trying to keep up with some of the releases that are coming out as we move forward. So since this is a few weeks old, I do want to, or a few weeks late, I do want to, say a big thank you to all of you guys who clicked on this video, who are interested in my thoughts. You guys know Star Wars is my favorite thing of all time. I've talked about it countless times here on the channel, and The Acolyte has been a fairly exhausting show to talk about. And Star Wars in a lot of ways is always fairly divisive nowadays, especially post The Last Jedi. But there are certain installments that maybe don't get as much hate. Something like The Bad Batch, which seems to be universally either some people just didn't watch it, or people just for the most part seem to enjoy it. I enjoy it enough that it doesn't get hate like this show, The Acolyte. So between the hate that this show had and just the toxic element of it online, and just how kind of exhausting it became, as well as this review being so much later, I want to say a big thanks to all of you guys who are clicking on this video to hear my thoughts. Now, if you guys have been following the channel, you'll know that I actually got to check out the first 4 episodes of The Acolyte a little bit early, which was an amazing thing. I was so grateful that Disney sent me over the first 4 episodes to check out early. The first 2 episodes premiered on that same day that I dropped the review for those first 4 episodes. So it was kind of cool to be like 3 weeks ahead of everybody else on a new Star Wars show, and I was pretty hyped. That review actually did fairly well for a channel of my size in terms of viewership, with a little bit over 2,000 views in just a couple of days, but easily became my most disliked video, as I was getting called a Disney shill, being accused of being paid by Disney for a good review in that video, and got plenty of negative comments in that video. But I also heard a lot of positive, and a lot of people that were intrigued, and people who saw the first few episodes who came back to that video just to say, hey, I'm actually intrigued. And I think the big takeaway from me when it came to that review was that I saw the potential of a really cool show here. I was really excited to see the live action debut of the High Republic, which is of course book series that has expanded upon this era. It was nice to be able to see it in live action, the Jedi robes from those books and comics brought to live action, that era in general. I really enjoyed a lot about the aesthetic. It was nice to have a live action Jedi show too, not just a show that features Jedi in it that's live action like the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, but a show that shows the Jedi in more of their prime. It's not something we have really seen in live action since the prequel. So I was really excited to check out where this show was going to go. Now, I mentioned in that review there was a couple of elements that were a little bit goofy here and there, but overall the show for me ended with episode 4 at that time, and left off on a cliffhanger of a lot of action, and left me really excited to see where things were going to go. And of course, it was just gaining so much negative feedback before the show even aired. There was a percentage of the audience that wanted this show to fail, and then there was a percentage of the audience who watched the show and just didn't love it. There were some people who enjoyed it for sure, and then there's people like me who at this point now I can say, after having seen all the episodes of the show, that it was a show that kind of lost me as time goes on, funny enough. Some of you might be thinking, oh man, you were so hyped on it for those first 4 episodes, what happened? Now, since the show has premiered its final episode 2 weeks ago at this point, I am going to be talking about spoilers. This won't be a play-by-play of every little thing that happens, but I'm going to do a quick little spoiler-free section right here before we get into it, for those of you who are interested in just hearing my thoughts on the show. I think that for the most part, for a show that has double the budget of majority of the other live action Star Wars shows. In some areas you can see where that budget was put into and the show looks great. In other areas you wonder where that budget went. Overall, I think the show was well acted and had an intriguing, at first, murder mystery surrounding Jedi being murdered. There was some sort of mysterious dark figure off in the corner. Being part of a new era in live action definitely added a lot of intrigue and gave a fresh kind of feel and vibe to Star Wars. As I mentioned, there were some goofy elements, but overall I was pretty excited. And then you get to the middle point of the show where there's a big point of the show where there's a lot of action and a lot of characters end up falling to lightsabers in amidst this action. And I won't get too deep into spoilers just yet for those of you who have not seen the show, but I found that because we lost so many of the main characters at a certain point in the show, and the last part of the show focused on such a small group of characters, you would have thought that they would have done more to really expand upon the stories of those characters in those final 4 episodes, only for me to really feel that by the time we came to the end, that I was just feeling like the show was enjoyable enough. It was definitely my least favorite of the live action Star Wars shows. I am by no means on the hate train of this is absolute travesty, it ruins my childhood, all of those exaggerative terms that people use for this show. I just felt that the show at the time, by the time I got to the end, just ultimately didn't tell a compelling enough story for me to feel like I'm dying to revisit it. I'm dying to learn more about these characters, because by the time I got to the end, I found that the most intriguing characters were kind of thrown to the wayside. I found that there were some cool characters that just weren't done enough with, and then the characters that we spend the most time with, I ultimately felt like the show never did enough to really expand upon them and give us character development that made you really care about their journey. And by the time we got to the end, it also felt like we were kind of regurgitating the same things over and over and over again. For instance, before we get into the spoiler section, there is a main Jedi character in this show who we learn fairly early into the show is hiding something. That something in the past happened that he was involved in that was a central point to why a lot of things are happening in this show. And at a certain point, when it becomes very clear, every episode for like 4 or 5 episodes is him just saying that he's going to fess up to what happened. He's going to tell the truth. He's going to explain what happened, only for the second that he's about to do so, something to kind of interrupt that. And ultimately we get to the next episode and it's a similar thing. He's kind of teetering on the fact that something happened, that he did something he's not proud of. And again, as soon as it's kind of gonna leave his lips, it ultimately is kind of, something happens, some sort of distraction, something that ends up kind of interrupting this moment. And it just felt like moments like that kept happening over the course of the show, where it felt like a lot more style than substance. This show, I think, features some of the coolest in terms of live action Star Wars shows, costume design, and some of the coolest sets that they've used in some of these shows. Maybe not as much as something like The Mandalorian or the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, in my personal opinion, but had some of the coolest sets. Really enjoyed the look and feel of this show in a lot of ways, and without a doubt featured probably the best lightsaber choreography that we've seen in the Disney era of Star Wars. So there are some big positives to take away from the show. There are some really cool things. There are certain characters that I thought were really cool. But by the time we got to the end, it felt like a missed opportunity. It felt like 8 episodes of a show that could have been told in less than 8 episodes. It almost felt like it could have been told more in the movie's length if they would have been able to hone in on certain elements. And the mystery of the show that was part of what was really intriguing in the first few episodes kind of dwindles away. And eventually you have what is meant to be a murder mystery that doesn't really have much mystery. And I mentioned before, there's this character that's kind of hiding something. Because of the way that they choose to kind of handle that being revealed, at a certain point, it just genuinely felt to me that like it was so clear what had happened, right? Like you could just read between the lines and understand what happened. So overall, my thoughts on the Acolyte, non-spoilers, would be that I thought the show was very well made and very well acted in a lot of ways, had some really cool action sequences. I enjoyed the visuals. There was a couple of moments where it didn't look as cool. It felt very much like TV Star Wars or Star Wars on a budget, where there are other moments where it looks fantastic. So I think there are some really key moments in this show that I thought were really awesome, and I think there's some cool elements, and I'm excited to see what they do with season 2. I think that they can maybe learn from certain things, but ultimately by the time we got into the middle point of the show and we're getting up to the climax, I just kind of kept feeling like the episodes just didn't have enough meat on the bone. And by the time we got to the end, I was just like, that was cool. I enjoyed the final episode. I thought there was some cool elements there, but some things just felt just wildly undercooked. And around a lot of the negativity around this show, one of the things that is undeniably frustrating are the creators, and most notably the lead showrunner and writer and one of the directors of the show, Leslie Headland. She came out and made a lot of comments about this show in a way that I thought she kind of just set herself up for failure. They added some LGBTQ elements to the show, which I don't care about, added naturally. But coming out and saying this is the gayest Star Wars show, when nothing about it was ever overtly gay. There were elements about it that, again, included LGBTQ elements. But coming out and saying that, I feel like you already kind of make it feel like it's trying to push something on people versus it just feeling normal as it should. Outside of that as well, even some comments that I think were blown out of proportion, like her saying that she feels like R2-D2 is a lesbian. I know that that was a joke, and as somebody who works with a lot of people who are part of the LGBTQ community, I know that's something that can kind of be thrown around to people who aren't lesbians, just maybe because they're in touch with their emotions, or maybe there's a joke around it in a way. I have coworkers who call me a lesbian, and I'm clearly not. I'm a heterosexual man who just got married to a woman. They all know that. They say it in jest. So I didn't really take that comment from her all that serious, but it created this discourse around the show that wasn't even really about the show. And so there were other times also where there were things that fans weren't in love with that happened in the show, and Leslie Headland would say these things to try to kind of defend these story choices, and I feel like it ultimately kind of ended up biting her in the ass. I feel like it ended up kind of like working against her, because it was kind of adding fuel to the fire for these fans who already wanted to hate the show. The show was unfortunately, the victim to a lot of review bombing. There was even other things called Acolyte or The Acolytes or something like that online that were getting review bombed by accident because of this. There's no getting around the fact that there were people who watched the show and were really disappointed, but then there was also a percentage of the audience who just was trying to hate this show before episodes even dropped. Episodes on IMDb were getting negative reviews as soon as the opportunity opened up. And so it's undeniable that there was a percentage of the audience that wanted this show to fail 100%. And I think that Leslie Headland and some of the other writers who came out and spoke about some of these controversies didn't always have the best PR training, maybe, or the best things that they could say to kind of negate some of this hate ever so slightly. I feel like a lot of times they were adding fuel to the fire. So yeah, guys, let's go ahead and move into the spoiler section now. So that's my warning. Overall, the Acolyte is a show I wish I enjoyed a lot more, but I didn't hate it. And so let's get into it. Like I said, I saw the first 4 episodes, and the first 2 episodes really sets up that murder mystery as we're introduced to Amanda Stenberg's character as these 2 individual twin sisters, May and Osha, one being the evil sister and one of them being the good sister. Now, May is the one going around murdering these individual Jedi, and right out of the gate, we're introduced to Carrie-Anne Moss's character, Master Endara, who's killed really early into the show, and that immediately started a lot of discourse online. Here's this Jedi who gets a little dagger in the chest and dies very, very soon into the show. And Carrie-Anne Moss was one of the several Jedi who were heavily marketed as big parts of this show, and she's on the banner that you can see on Disney Plus. So she seems like she'd be a big integral part. And while her character does have more to do in a lot of the flashback sequences throughout the course of the show, she's ultimately dispatched of very quickly, and that was a bit of a disheartening thing to see. But I was definitely intrigued to see where it was going to go. I figured, okay, cool, we're going to learn more about these Jedi and why they're being hunted in these flashbacks, and we do once we get into episode 3. But yeah, I think the first 2 episodes did a good job of introducing us to the High Republic era. We get to be introduced to our main characters, Master Soul, played by Jung-Jae, who was probably my favorite character in the show. I thought that he gave the best performance, reminded me a lot of Qui-Gon Jinn, and I actually said that in my review for the first 4 episodes, only for him to come out and actually say that was kind of his intention, that he studied Qui-Gon Jinn to kind of play this Jedi. And I think he did a really good job when it came down to conveying a very Qui-Gon Jinn-esque kind of Jedi. On top of him, we're also introduced to characters like Jackie Lon, played by Daphne Keane, and Charlie Barnett, Yord Fandar, who I thought were 2 interesting Jedi. You have Yord Fandar, who is really by the book, really by the rules. He feels like he's this Jedi that has to abide by all of the rules. And then you have Jackie Lon, who is just kind of in the mix, as this apprentice who wants to prove herself, but also is starting to have these nice connections with Osha as they pull Osha into the mix as they're looking for her sister. And I found that to be all really, really intriguing. I really enjoyed a lot of the character dynamics. We had a lot of various different kind of characters in the mix that all have different approaches. Some are a little bit more ambitious, some are a little bit more reserved. Some characters feel a little bit more reactive than others, and I think it created an interesting dynamic as these Jedi are working with this one sister to go and try to find the other sister. I thought it really created an interesting storyline. And so then we get into the third episode, and I mentioned that there was something in my last review that was a little bit goofy, and it was that third episode. This is where we get to learn about the origins of May and Osha, where we learn that they're two twins that were actually created through magic, something called the thread, which is another version of the Force, so to speak, that is tapped into via these witches. And so there was so much going on online before this episode even aired, that the thread was now the new Force, and everybody was like, may the thread be with you. And there was all this joke saying that the Force had been ruined, and that now it's being called the thread, and that it's these women that are able to tap into the Force and blah, blah, blah. And ultimately, for me, at a certain point, I thought that was so ridiculous, because we've seen magic in Star Wars countless times, and clearly some of these witches came from Dathomir. There's definitely, one of them is clearly a Dathomirian. She's the character of Mother Corey, played by Margarita Leviva. And it was very much felt like the sisters, the Night Sisters of Dathomir, very much felt like a Mother Talzin kind of thing. Maybe not as dark of a magic, but it felt like a similar kind of magic. And outside of them, in Legends and in canon, there have been various forms of magic that people can tap into that is maybe a part of the Force or kind of a distinct, kind of different kind of magic. And so for me, this didn't feel all that different. I saw people saying like this kind of ruins the lore. I didn't think so, but I did find this episode to be a little bit cringy at times. I enjoyed the lore elements of it, but you have these two young actresses who are playing May and Osha that I don't necessarily think were giving great performances, very much felt like child performances. And we do get to see them later on in some flashback episodes again. I never really felt like there were standouts in those episodes. Some of their performances weren't great. Amidst this, we're introduced to their main mother, which is the character of Mother Anasea, played by Jodie Turner-Smith. And I think she is an interesting character in the mix as she's trying to kind of indoctrinate these two young girls that they created through this magic to be a part of their witch coven. And of course, she ends up kind of butting heads with the Jedi in this flashback when they learn that these two young girls are being trained to kind of tap into magic, and they want to, train them to become Jedi, or at least test them to see if they can become Jedi. And May doesn't want to, Osha does want to. This creates a rift between the two of them. And I found a lot of that to be intriguing still. Again, I think some people acted like this episode was absolute dog crap. And I was kind of in the middle. I thought that it was goofy at times, but it still had some interesting elements. I was really curious to see where it was going to go. And mind you, I'm very much of the mentality that I don't really like to judge a movie or a TV show until it's done, or at least till the season's done. Or in the case of a movie, there's plenty of times I've seen a movie and I'm not super on board, but then it kind of wins me over by the time we get to the end. But the same can happen in the opposite direction as well. And in the case of a TV show, I had only seen the first 4 episodes. So even though I wasn't crazy about everything I was seeing, I was pretty intrigued that there was still 4 more episodes, and it could definitely lead us into a really cool and interesting direction. In this episode, I would say the goofiest thing that just didn't really work for me too much was this scene where they're kind of doing like a seance, if you will, to kind of indoctrinate these girls into the coven in a certain way. And they're like saying like the power of one, the power of two, the power of many, all this stuff. And it just kept making me think of the guy from SpongeBob that was like the power within. Take that as you will. So there was some goofy elements in that episode. Now, episode 4 is an interesting episode. And amidst all this, we're introduced to a character named Kymir, who just seems to be a shopkeeper who's working alongside May, but also works for this Dark Lord that is sending out May to kill these various Jedi. I thought he was an interesting character. He's played by Manny Jacinto. And he's later on, let's just jump forward a little bit. In episode 5, he's revealed to be the big bad. And that for me was a little disappointing, because he was the one that seemed like the obvious choice that he was going to be revealed as the big bad. So that was another thing that was kind of disappointing about the show, is that when it was trying to reveal something, I think it sometimes felt like it was more clever than it was, when a lot of these reveals felt fairly obvious. And in the case of Kymir being the stranger, as they call him, he's never really given a name. I enjoyed his performance, and ultimately I think he was one of the best parts of the show, right behind the character of Master Soul. But I don't really feel like they did in abundance with his character to make me feel like really attached to him. He was just kind of a random throwaway character to the side. Ultimately, it's revealed that he's the bad guy. Then he becomes far more intriguing. but it felt like the obvious kind of direction they were going to go with. So that was a bit of a lackluster element. But yeah, the fourth episode was mostly the characters going to find Master Kelnaka, one of the Jedi that's in danger of being killed, and he is the Wookiee Jedi played by Jonas Suotamo, who plays Chewbacca in the more recent Star Wars project. So I was excited. I actually went to MegaCon here in Orlando, Florida, earlier this year, and got to be in a panel where he was talking about being a part of this show and how awesome it was. And while there is some cool stuff with Kelnaka later on, we get to see some flashbacks where he gets to do some lightsaber action, which was really cool. I ultimately found Kelnaka to be just another throwaway character, that another really cool Jedi character that they really based a lot of this marketing on, ultimately who got thrown to the wayside. And that just kind of broke my heart. He gets killed off camera. And we never really get to see him do much in the present day in the story. It's just kind of him being there as a part of the story for the characters to go find him. This is where all of our characters end up being reintroduced or being introduced to the villain. There's that great shot that's in the trailers initially, which is the last things I saw when I first saw the first 4 episodes, which was all these Jedi lined up with their lightsabers running towards this one, what seemingly seemed to be a dark side user, some sort of Sith. They run towards him, and he pushes them all back with the Force, and that's where that episode ended. So I was ecstatic to see when I saw that final episode. I was ecstatic to see what episode 5 was going to hold for us. And so then we get into episode 5, and yeah, without a doubt, some of the best lightsaber combat in all of the Disney Star Wars era. Definitely some of the best choreography, big, fast-paced, over-the-top sequences, a lot of people fighting each other. We find out that the character of the Stranger actually has cortosis on his arms or one of his arms and on his helmet, which is something back in the day that was used in Legends storytelling as well as in modern day canon storytelling, which is a metal alloy that when it touches lightsabers can kind of disengage them and turn them off. So he's like headbutting lightsabers and using his arm to knock some of them off while he's fighting them with the lightsaber, which made for some of the coolest action. And what's cool is they don't say that it's cortosis until a few episodes later, but if you're a fan of Star Wars books and comics, you would know that it's cortosis. So as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, that's so cool to see that they brought cortosis into live action. I'm sure some people were wildly confused as to how this guy was doing that, and it is explained later on, but it is something that is part of the defined part of Star Wars lore. So that kind of stuff I did really enjoy, where I like that they kind of pulled some deep cuts out. But yeah, that 5th episode has been praised by many to be probably the best episode in the season. In a lot of ways I agree, in a lot of ways I don't. I think overall it's probably the best action-wise, and visually it's one of the coolest in the entire show. It's where we're introduced to who this villain is, but narratively I found it to be fairly hollow. And by the time we got to the end of the show, it just felt like, or the end of that episode, we lost tons of characters, including Yord Fondar, as well as Jackie, and just tons of all the random other Jedi that are in the mix. And so we lose some of our central characters pretty early on. I think way earlier than I think the show had really done enough with them, for it to feel, I don't know, kind of earned, and so they do die. It is sad to see them go. This episode ends up ending with May and Osha kind of being mixed up, and now May has gone off with Master Soul to pretend to be Osha, and Osha got knocked out and ended up waking up and being taken by the Stranger. And so then she's off with the bad guy, the good sister's off with the bad guy, the bad sister's off with the good guy, and the next few episodes are really spent kind of regurgitating a lot of stuff. You have the bad guy trying to get Osha to be turned to the dark side for a majority of the time that they spend together, and you have May kind of trying to deceive Master Soul, only for her to kind of be outed eventually, and him promising to tell her what happened, only for kind of what I mentioned earlier to continually happen, where just every time he's going to say something gets in the way. And it felt like that was majority of the next few episodes until we get to the second to last episode, which is essentially all of the footage from the 3rd episode, the flashback episode, repurposed with some added context from a different perspective to kind of show us a little bit more of what happened that night with May and Osha's family and how they all died. Of course, we learn amidst all this that Master Soul did end up killing Mother Anastasia, and what felt like a very dramatic move on a Jedi level. Like, she's kind of turning into like a witchy mist, and he just kind of stabs her. it felt a lot of times like the Jedi in this show didn't necessarily make the most Jedi rational decisions, which was a frustrating thing, I think, not only for myself, but a lot of people in the audience. And I think the 7th episode of the show is probably one of my least favorite live action Star Wars TV episodes of all time. I thought it was very weakly written. It really relied on the footage we had already seen in the 3rd episode. So in a lot of ways, it felt like while it did add context, it felt fairly redundant. And that added context was something that you were able to just kind of read through the lines and see based on what we had already seen earlier in the show, and kind of what was already said. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, where I feel like the show was trying to reveal things in a way that was like, oh, here's the big reveal. But if you watch a lot of TV, if you read a lot of stories, if you watch a lot of movies and you're familiar with storytelling tropes, it just felt so obvious where a lot of these big reveals were going that ultimately it just never really had that impact that I think that the showrunners and the writers and the directors really wanted it to have. There's some cool action in that flashback episode. I mentioned that Kelnaka gets to do some cool lightsaber action there. Some great stuff coming also from the character of Torben, who I haven't mentioned here, played by Dean Charles Chapman. And he's a character who was a Padawan in all of the flashback sequences. He's got some cool lightsaber sequence kind of moments there in that 7th episode as well. But yeah, he was a character that they really didn't do much with. He's just kind of a bit of a reactionary young punk Padawan who doesn't really want to listen. And then when we see him in the present time, right before he's poisoned and dies at the hand of May, he's just like a guilty guy who's kind of put himself into seclusion. There's a thing that Jedi do that they kind of just like hunker down if they feel a sense of guilt, and they kind of go off into hiding. And it's kind of just like a meditation of just pure shame. And so he went and did that, and they put this like wig and beard on him to kind of age him, but the actor looks so young that it looked so goofy to me. It felt very much like some of the like hair and wigs that you'd see some of like the Munchkins have in the Wizard of Oz. I don't know if anybody else felt like that. I wasn't a big fan of his look in the present day scenes. It felt kind of cheap looking, and it felt like they maybe should have cast an older actor or done something else to make him look older. I felt like the hairline and everything just tried to make him look too old. And it ultimately just kind of made him look goofy, to be honest. But yeah, he's a part of those flashback sequences along with Carrie-Anne Moss and the character of Kelnaka and Master Soul. And yeah, really all of this is really meant to kind of just showcase that Master Soul was the one who killed Mother Anastasia. But it was so obvious, again, that was already the case that there was really no surprise. This all leads up to the final episode, where there is finally a showdown between May and Osha, which I thought was cool. They're both kind of using similar fights. Amidst all this, we end up learning that May and Osha were created as two, but they're actually one, which is why the two of them feel so connected, but also feel like not necessarily whole. They all feel kind of a disconnect within themselves, and it's because they are they are the same person split into two. And so we end up learning this. They were built through a vergence in the Force on that planet. Master Soul wanted to kind of out that vergence so that the Jedi know about it, but of course he ends up making this horrible decision to kill Mother Anastasia. She tells him, I was gonna let Osha go with you to become a Jedi. It becomes this whole situation, and now the Jedi are trying to keep it under wraps. They end up lying to Osha for all those years as to what happened. And so here we are now in the final showdown of what's going down. There's a showdown going on between Master Soul and the Stranger, Chimere, which I thought was cool. Definitely some of the coolest lightsaber action in the Disney Star Wars era. I could not deny there was some cool Force play and Force repulse and action with the lightsabers that was going on in this sequence, and I really thoroughly enjoyed that fight. I won't lie. I even enjoyed the fight between May and Osha in that final episode. It was cool that they had a lot of the same moves at times, as it is revealed that they are the same person, so their approach to things were very similar, and I thought that was handled really, really well when it came down to the choreography side of things. Amidst all this, another character I haven't mentioned in this review is the character of Vaneshra Rao, who's played by Rebecca Henderson, and she was a character I was excited to see in this show, as she's a character from the High Republic books and comics and novels, and she feels like a different character in this show. Now, this is an older iteration of the character than we've seen in previous things, but she feels like an older iteration of the character in this show. She doesn't necessarily feel like the character that we followed in the books and comics. She feels a little bit more hardened and a little bit more willing to do the wrong thing as a Jedi. which was a little bit disappointing to see, but I'm curious to see what they go with that moving forward. It was cool to see her whip saber in the show, which some people had issue with, which is like, if you don't know about whip sabers in Star Wars, that's been around for a very, very long time. Whip laser or energy weapons in Star Wars has been around for a very long time, especially whip lightsabers. It's just the first time we've seen one in live action, and again, she's been using that in the books and comics for years now. That was cool to see. She ends up kind of being in the mix of all this, kind of trying to cover it up. She's kind of this random side character in a lot of ways who doesn't have an abundance to do until the very end of the show, where she ends up going to where Master Soul is fighting Chimere, and where May and Osha are fighting. Amidst all this, this is where May and Osha end up kind of getting the full truth from Soul that he did kill Mother Anastasia, and May decides to end up just killing him right there. She ends up killing Master Soul right there via like a force choke, and moments like this felt unearned. There was a couple of moments with May and Osha where the two of them kind of flipped sides and flipped their view on things. While I can understand why those decisions were made as characters, their motivation, it felt abrupt a lot of times when they would kind of change their stance on something. And so Osha just turning dark and wanting to kill Master Soul right there in that sequence, for me, just felt so abrupt and kind of unearned, and it was an unfortunate, frustrating element to the way the show ended. Amidst all this, Master Soul's lightsaber gets damaged where the kyber crystal comes out of its casing. It becomes a little bit more open for you to actually touch. And amidst all this happening, we get to see the first time that a lightsaber is bled in live action, which is a thing that Jedi do, where they're able to bleed the lightsaber crystal of a Jedi that they killed, or a Jedi lightsaber crystal that they got their hands on, and able to put their dark side energy into it to make it the red saber that we all know and love. And so we have seen characters like Darth Vader or Kylo Ren do this in the comics, and it's way more epic in the comics, though they are touching the crystal itself. Here, it was happening while the crystal was still in the saber, so it was still functioning as a lightsaber, so we get to see it go from blue to red. That upset a lot of people, but it made sense to me, at least enough, because of the fact that the lightsaber had been damaged, the hilt had been damaged, and now you had that crystal a little bit more exposed. So I was able to buy into it a little bit, but I can understand how that maybe frustrated some people, but it was still cool to see in live action. So yeah, the show ends up ending with May ending having her mind erased by Chimere, the stranger, only for the stranger and Osha to go off on their own. And Vernestra Rwoh comes back to find Master Soul was killed, and they end up covering up this whole thing that Master Soul was actually the bad guy, in order for them to no longer kind of have this threat that there is some sort of dark side user out there. Of course, they end up having to kind of go to the Senate and explain that this was one rogue Jedi who went bad, ended up killing a bunch of Jedi, and this kind of thing will never happen again. And of course, Chimere and Osha end up going off on their own, and now May has no recollection of what's happened before. Now, I should mention that one of the biggest reveals of the final episode is the character of Darth Plagueis. Of course, Darth Plagueis Tawais, the master of Palpatine. He makes a quick, brief cameo as he sees Chimere and Osha leave the planet that they're on earlier in the show, which almost looked a lot like Ahch-To from The Last Jedi. I don't know if it was the same planet. I don't think it was, but they just say unknown planet in the show. But yeah, first time live action Darth Plagueis. It was really exciting to see. It got me pumped up, but it was frustrating because they do nothing else with it. It's just a quick little tease, so I'm assuming it's going to be a bigger part of the next season. But on one hand, super badass to see. On another hand, is it going to pan out? We'll see. The show ends up ending with the final shot with Vernestra Rwoh going to the Jedi Council. We get to see the back of Yoda's head, as of course she's going to come and now lie to Jedi Master Yoda about what's happened, that it was Master Soul and that there was no red lightsaber wielding dark side user out there. And so yeah, this kind of, I guess, starts to showcase, we're 100 years before the events of Revenge of the Sith. This starts to showcase where the Jedi are starting to go wrong with a lot of things. This is where they start to kind of manipulate the truth a little bit in order for them to consistently look like the good guys. Of course, we know that kind of outlook on things as time goes on, and their bigger connections into politics as time goes on, as we get to the Clone Wars, eventually would be their downfall. And so I guess this is kind of sowing that seed. And the one last thing I got to talk about in this show that happened earlier in the show was the cameo appearance of the character of Ki-Adi Mundi. And that that, of course, pissed off a lot of people because, number one, in Legends, he was not even born yet at this time. They have now changed it in canon that he was born before the original birth date that he had. Changing his birth date didn't bother me too much, but like a lot of people, it was weird that they chose to include him as a Jedi who was hearing about what's going on, as he is the Jedi in The Phantom Menace, who would go on to say that, you know, the Sith have been gone for millennia, and he's surprised to hear about Darth Maul. He says that's impossible because they've been gone for such a long time. So to know that he heard that something was going on and that there was possibly somebody out there who was a dark Jedi of some sort, did have a lot of Star Wars fans scratching their heads. And my thoughts on it are, I don't mind that they changed his birth date. I think it could have been any other Jedi. I don't think they needed to have changed Ki-Adi-Mundi's lore. I don't think it was this lore-breaking thing like a lot of people think, because at the end of the day, it did end up getting covered up. So I can buy into that enough. But I do agree that it didn't need to be him. Why add Ki-Adi-Mundi for the sake of a cameo? Why, of all the Jedi, make it him who literally says, impossible, the Sith have been dead for a millennia in The Phantom Menace? That was a bit of a frustrating choice. I don't necessarily hate it, and I'm not as outraged about it as a lot of people were when this was happening. But yeah, it just kind of begs the question of why did they choose to do that? With all that said, I thought the Acolyte had some really cool action, some really good performances at times. It had a lot of intriguing characters that I would have liked to have seen go on for further amounts of time that were ultimately killed. And by the time we got to the last few episodes, while there's some great moments of action, some great moments of visuals, and I'm really intrigued to see what they do with things like Plagueis and Yoda in the following season, it is unfortunate that there's so much about this show that ultimately feels like they didn't really do enough with. There's a lot of characters that were end up killed way too early, and the characters that they do keep around for the latter part of the show, I just feel like we're running in circles with a lot of these story beats that ultimately kind of came to a head at the final episode for you to kind of be like, yeah, I saw that that's where it was going. There wasn't as much intrigue or mystery week to week in comparison to other shows. When I think about me watching things like the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, or things like Ahsoka, or watching things like The Mandalorian, or things even like The Bad Batch and The Clone Wars and The Rebels and all the various other Star Wars shows, while not every episode and not every story beat has always been my favorite, those shows still kept me with a sense of intrigue and surprise week to week. They were able to give me that surprise all the time. And in the case of the Acolyte, there wasn't that surprise that I want from Star Wars. There wasn't that element that made me feel emotional when I come to Star Wars. It was fun to watch. I don't think it's a bad, horrible show, but I don't necessarily think it's a great show. I would say it's somewhere in the middle. I thought it was just without a doubt, probably my least favorite Star Wars show altogether. I would say I even enjoy things like Star Wars Resistance a lot more, because over time I found myself at least more connected to those characters than I did here with the Acolyte, despite the Acolyte having some of the coolest action maybe in the entire franchise. So that's going to be my very long overdue review for the Acolyte. Definitely look forward to hearing your guys' thoughts down below, so hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.